It was late, well past midnight, when I found myself on that lonely stretch of highway. The rain had been relentless for hours, slapping the windshield with a rhythm that seemed almost haunting. My headlights cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but the wet, slick asphalt and the occasional blur of a tree or fence post in the distance. I had been driving for what felt like an eternity, the only sound accompanying me being the hum of the engine and the steady tapping of raindrops against the car. I'd been to a friend's wedding earlier that evening, an event I would have rather skipped, but it was important to them, so I went. The drive back to my apartment was a long one, about 2 hours, through the kind of remote roads that barely saw any traffic. I didn't mind the solitude. It gave me time to think, to clear my head. But tonight, something was different. I first noticed it when I saw the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was another car coming up behind me, but then it didn't go away. The vehicle, if you could even call it that, was tailing me, too close for comfort. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just another driver impatient to get past, but the car remained there, almost as if it was glued to my bumper. I could barely make out the shape of it through the sheets of rain, but there was something wrong about it. The lights were too bright, almost blinding. They didn't flicker or dim when I changed lanes, and the sound of its engine never seemed to get any louder or softer. It was as if the car had no intention of passing me. My heart began to race. There was no reason for anyone to be out here at this hour in this weather. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the road was treacherous, barely any streetlights to guide the way. I told myself I was being paranoid, maybe just tired after a long night, but the sensation of being followed grew stronger. I pressed on the accelerator, trying to get some distance between myself and whatever was behind me. But every time I checked the rearview mirror, those headlights were still there, glaring at me through the downpour. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just being followed. I was being hunted. The rain continued to lash against the windshield, and the wipers struggled to keep up. My palms grew slick with sweat as I gripped the wheel, my knuckles turning white. Then, just as I passed a bend in the road, the headlights disappeared. I glanced back, half relieved, but that relief quickly evaporated when I saw something even worse. The road behind me was empty, not a single car in sight, nothing. I quickly checked the mirror again. Nothing. The car had just vanished. I had to pull over. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest that I could hear it thumping in my ears. I rolled the window down a little, the cold air rushing in, mixing with the smell of wet pavement and pine. I sat there for a few moments, trying to calm myself. Maybe I had imagined it? Maybe the car had simply passed me and I hadn't noticed? My rational mind kept making excuses, trying to convince me that nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But then I heard something. A faint, wet sound, like footsteps. It was coming from the other side of my car, near the passenger side. My blood ran cold, and I froze, my eyes darting around the empty road. The sound came closer, like someone was walking in the rain, heavy footsteps echoing through the quiet night. I wasn't alone. There was someone, or something, out there. My breathing hitched. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. Slowly, I turned my head toward the passenger side window. Through the rain-smeared glass, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure. Tall and gaunt, its features distorted by the storm, its face barely visible under a soaked, tattered hood. I couldn't make out the details, but I saw enough to know it wasn't human. The figure stood there, just a few feet away, staring at me with what I can only describe as empty, hollow eyes. No expression, just an eerie stillness. The footsteps stopped, and the figure raised a hand. It pointed directly at me. My breath caught in my throat as I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires squealed as the car lurched forward, careening down the slick road. I didn't dare look back, not even for a second, as I sped down the highway. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that? What was that? I drove for what felt like hours, but the further I went, the more I felt like something was watching me. The pressure in the air, the sense of unease, it was suffocating. The sound of rain against the car became deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed again. I didn't see any more headlights in the rearview mirror, but it didn't matter. I could feel the presence of something out there, just beyond the veil of the storm. I eventually reached a small town, barely more than a gas station, a few houses, and a diner. But it was a welcome sight. I pulled into the station, my hands shaking as I killed the engine. The storm still raged, but at least I wasn't on that desolate road anymore. I walked into the station, eager to get out of the car, my nerves on edge. The old man behind the counter gave me a curious look as I walked in, drenched and disheveled. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice raspy and tired. I nodded, unable to speak at first. There was something about the way he looked at me, though, that made me uneasy. "I saw something," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. The old man paused, wiping his hands on a rag before leaning in closer. "What did you see?" he asked, almost too casually. I don't know," I stammered. "I was driving, and I thought someone was following me. A car, but then it just disappeared. And then I saw someone by my window. A figure. It was wrong. Not human, or at least not like any person I've ever seen." He didn't flinch, didn't seem surprised. "That happens around here sometimes," he said with a far-off look in his eyes. "The rain makes people see things, or maybe it's something else." I stared at him, confused. "Something else?" The old man nodded slowly. "There's a stretch of highway out there, just past the old bridge. Folks say the spirits of those who died in accidents there still wander. They get confused, lost in the storm, and sometimes they try to make contact." I felt my stomach drop. "You're telling me it was a ghost?" The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me like he was weighing whether or not to tell me more. "All I know is, you're not the first to see things on that road. You won't be the last either." I didn't know what to say. All I could think about was getting out of there. I paid for some coffee and sat at a booth in the corner, trying to collect myself. The storm raged outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, waiting. I never drove that road again. Enjoyed this story? Make sure to subscribe for your next terrifying tale.
Next story.
I'll never forget that night. It was a late autumn evening, the kind where the chill in the air makes you want to wrap yourself up in a blanket and hide away from the world. But I had to be somewhere. I had to get home. My work shift had run long, and by the time I was leaving, the streets were empty, save for the occasional car passing by. The sky had darkened, and the weather had turned for the worse. The rain came pouring down in sheets, and the wind howled like a wild animal trapped outside. It was the kind of night where you could barely see anything through the windshield, and the road was slick, almost treacherous. I hadn't planned to drive through the back roads, but I decided to take the shortcut. The longer route would have taken me another hour, and I was exhausted. Besides, I'd driven that route 1,000 times before, and I knew it well. The winding road through the woods, with its strange turns and eerie silence, had always unsettled me a little, but it was faster. Faster. I never thought much of it until that night. The rain kept getting worse, blurring my vision. The wipers squeaked loudly, struggling to keep up with the downpour, but it was no use. The headlights illuminated nothing but the sheets of water falling from the sky, and the trees on either side of the road loomed like dark shadows. I turned up the radio, hoping the noise would calm my nerves, but it did nothing. The radio signal was spotty, flickering in and out between static, but then a voice came through, clear for a second, involved in a gruesome accident. The voice said, the words breaking off before I could make sense of it. I immediately turned the volume up, trying to catch what the broadcaster was saying, but the static returned and I was left with nothing but white noise. I rolled my eyes. Just my luck. I had been driving for about 20 minutes, my mind half on the road and half on the faint memory of the radio report, when something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just the headlights of another car, but there was no car. I blinked and looked again, trying to focus, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing on the side of the road, drenched in rain. The tall, dark shape was just visible for a moment before disappearing behind a tree, almost like it was waiting for me. My heart raced. There was no one else out here, especially not in this kind of weather. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Or maybe it was a hitchhiker. But that didn't make sense either. Who would be out in this weather? The figure seemed strange, too still, too silent. I told myself it wasn't worth stopping. After all, I was almost home, and it was probably just some shadow or my tired eyes playing tricks. but the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. I reached a curve in the road, a sharp bend that led into a thick patch of trees, and that's when it happened. My headlights flashed briefly over the figure again, this time directly in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart jumping into my throat. There was no one there, but my headlights, they had caught something else. In the reflection of the wet road, I could see the outline of a person standing in the middle of the street, but when I looked again, nothing was there. My breathing was erratic, my hands shaking on the wheel. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. I looked down at the dashboard, no warning lights, everything seemed normal. I checked the rearview mirror, but still, no sign of anyone. I was beginning to panic now, my eyes darting around nervously. The rain had picked up, and the noise was deafening, but I swear I could hear something else. Something like footsteps, faint and soft. My mind was racing. I had to get off this road. I had to get to safety. I pressed the gas pedal harder, trying to leave the strange image behind. I rounded another bend and saw a figure in front of me again, standing by the road, but this time they were closer. Much closer. It was a woman, her hair soaked, clinging to her face, her white dress practically glowing against the darkness. She was just standing there, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. No movement, no sign that she was alive. I swerved to avoid her, the tires screeching as I maneuvered the car to the opposite side of the road. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I glanced back over my shoulder, expecting to see her in the rearview mirror. But once again, there was nothing. I had avoided her. I had to keep going. I couldn't stop. Not here. Not now. As I accelerated away, the unease I had felt earlier seemed to grow tenfold. Every dark shape in the distance seemed like another figure, waiting, watching. Every turn of the road made my pulse quicken. I didn't know if I was imagining things or if the roads were truly haunted. But by the time I reached the next corner, I was nearly breathless. And there she was again. The woman, standing just off the road, her back to me, her head tilted slightly to one side. It was too much. I could feel my eyes welling up with tears of fear. I couldn't breathe properly. I was on the edge. I pulled over. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the mind. Maybe I thought getting out of the car would make the nightmare stop. I threw open the door, rain pelting me instantly. The wind whipped through my hair as I looked up and down the road, searching for any sign of the woman. There was nothing. No sound but the pounding of the rain and the occasional rustle of the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I took a few hesitant steps forward, my feet slipping in the wet mud. I was just about to turn around and get back in the car when I heard it, the softest whisper, my name. I froze. "Hello?" I repeated, my voice trembling. I knew what I had heard, and I knew it wasn't the wind. I spun around. The woman stood before me, no more than a few feet away, her pale face drenched, her eyes still wide open, her mouth slightly parted. She took a single step toward me. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. My body wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped between my fear and the overwhelming need to escape. The woman's lips trembled as if she were trying to speak, but no sound emerged. Her hand reached out slowly, her fingers unnaturally long, her skin deathly cold. It felt like a lifetime before she spoke again. "Help me." The words sent a chill straight through my bones. Her voice was broken, distant, like she had been calling out for years, waiting for someone to hear her. I don't know how I did it, but somehow my feet moved. I ran back to the car, slamming the door behind me. I didn't look back. I drove as fast as I could, my hands trembling on the wheel, the headlights cutting through the rain. I kept my eyes forward, never daring to glance in the rearview mirror again. It wasn't until I reached home and finally got out of the car that I realized my legs felt weak, like I had been running for miles. But when I looked back toward the road, there was nothing there. No figure. No woman. Just the empty, wet road stretching out in the distance. I don't know if I was being haunted or if I had lost my mind. But every time it rains, I still hear that voice in my head, the whisper of the woman's words. Help me. Are you hooked on these spine-tingling stories? Subscribe to get more and never miss a scary moment.
Next story.
It was late and the rain kept pounding the windshield. My wipers could hardly keep up with the downpour, and the road ahead was barely visible through the sheets of water streaming down. The headlights cast a yellow glow, but it wasn't much help. It felt like I was driving through a wall of water, the sound of it pelting the car almost deafening. I had been driving for hours, and I was exhausted. I was headed back home after a weekend visit to a friend's cabin in the woods. The drive was supposed to be straightforward, just a few hours on the interstate, then a short stretch of back roads. But as the storm worsened, it felt like I was the only one on the road. I was already irritated by how late it was, but when my phone buzzed in the passenger seat, I grabbed it instinctively, hoping for some distraction. A message from my sister. "Are you okay? I saw a story on the news about a driver going missing last night in this area. Be careful." I felt a shiver run down my spine. The message didn't help, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. People went missing all the time, right? The rain seemed to be pouring harder now. I checked my fuel gauge, almost empty. Great. I hadn't passed a gas station in miles. As I rounded a bend in the road, I noticed the flickering of a light in the distance. It was faint at first, but as I got closer, I saw a gas station up ahead. Relief washed over me. I needed gas, and I needed to stretch my legs. I pulled into the station, but something felt off. There was a single dim light overhead, casting an eerie glow across the pumps. No other cars. I double-checked my surroundings, my heart racing for no real reason. It was just a run-of-the-mill gas station. I told myself I was being paranoid. I climbed out of the car and stood under the awning. The air smelled damp, like wet asphalt and stale gasoline. I looked around, wondering where the attendant was. There was no sign of life, but the lights were on. Strange. I went ahead and filled up, my hands trembling slightly as I slid the nozzle into my tank. Something about the place felt wrong, like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. I finished filling up and headed inside to pay, but when I pushed open the door, I was hit with a wave of cold air and silence. The cashier's counter was empty. The register was closed. No sound at all except the heavy rain outside. I waited for a moment, hoping someone would come out of the back, but the place was dead silent. A chill crept up my spine, and I had a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave. I turned and walked back to my car, my breath quickening. Just as I reached the door, I heard a voice behind me. "Hey, you going somewhere?" I spun around, heart in my throat. A man stood there, leaning against a pillar, his face obscured by shadows. He was wearing a thick, dark jacket, and his hair was soaked from the rain. He looked about my age, maybe a little older, but there was something unsettling about his presence. Yeah," I stammered, my voice shaking slightly. Just filling up, that's all." He smiled slowly, but it wasn't a friendly smile. There was something predatory about it, something that made my skin crawl. "You don't want to stay around here too long, you know? It's not safe." His voice had a strange tone, like he was warning me, but also trying to keep me interested. "Why's that?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though I could feel the tension in my shoulders. "The storm, for one. And the other thing." He trailed off, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. "Other thing?" I asked, though I wished I hadn't. But the man didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at the ground as if lost in thought. His hand moved toward his jacket pocket, and I instinctively took a step back, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something dragging along the wet ground. It came from the woods behind the gas station. It was faint at first, but then louder, sharper, and closer. A chill ran through me as I realized it wasn't just the wind or the rain. I looked around for a way out, but the man was blocking the entrance to my car. He still hadn't moved, just staring at me like he was waiting for something. "You should go," he said quietly, as if reading my mind. "It's better if you leave now." I didn't need any more encouragement. I turned and sprinted for the car, the sound of my footsteps drowned by the howling wind and the noise of the storm. I jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, my heart racing as I fumbled for the keys. As I started the engine, the man watched me through the rain-soaked window, his expression unreadable. He didn't move. I peeled out of the parking lot, my tires screeching on the wet asphalt. I didn't stop looking in my rearview mirror until I was miles away, but I never saw him again. As I continued my drive, the storm seemed to grow even worse. The road stretched out ahead of me, empty and dark, and the trees loomed like shadows. I kept glancing around, but all I could see were the occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the dark, wet night for a split second before plunging everything back into darkness. I could still hear that scraping sound, though. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't just in my head. It was there, just barely audible beneath the thunder. The miles dragged on, the storm never letting up, and the road felt endless. Eventually, I started to feel like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every gust of wind a warning. And no matter how much I tried to push it away, that scraping sound was always just behind me. And then in the distance, I saw a set of headlights approaching. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe another car, maybe another person. I slowed down, ready to wave them past. But as the car drew closer, I realized something was wrong. The headlights weren't coming from a regular car. They were too bright, too wide. And the shape of the vehicle, it didn't make sense. It was too large, too bulky, like something was moving in front of it. I glanced in my rearview mirror again, but the scraping sound had stopped. There was nothing but silence. I couldn't see anything behind me, but I felt watched. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white, as the strange headlights grew nearer. The vehicle was right on top of me now, and before I could react, it swerved past me on the wet road. I saw the outline of it in my peripheral vision, something massive, something almost mechanical. My heart pounded in my chest, and the car in front of me disappeared into the rain. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway, where things started to feel a little more normal. The storm finally began to ease up, and the headlights in front of me began to steady, but that feeling, that overwhelming sense that something was wrong, never left me. I'll never forget that night. The eerie gas station, the man's warning, the scraping noise in the woods, and the strange headlights that seemed to follow me out of nowhere. I never saw anyone else on the road, no other cars, no other drivers, but I know what I felt, and I'll never drive those back roads alone again. Feeling spooked? Subscribe for more terrifying tales that will send chills down your spine.
Next story.
It was the middle of November, and the kind of rain that seemed to come from nowhere had caught me off guard. I was driving back to my apartment in the city after visiting some old friends, my mind still spinning with conversations and laughter from the night before. The roads were slick, the air cold and damp, but I didn't mind. I loved the rain. It was soothing. At least that's what I told myself as the windshield wipers worked tirelessly to clear the water away. It had been a long drive, and as the miles stretched on, I felt the weight of exhaustion starting to creep into my body. I needed coffee. I needed something to wake me up. There wasn't much in the way of civilization out here, just a few scattered farms and woods along the winding country road. I had been on this stretch of road countless times, but tonight everything felt different. The rain made it hard to see, but as I glanced up, I saw a flicker of light in the distance, a gas station. It was a rundown, old place that barely looked open, but I thought maybe I could grab a cup of coffee. I pulled off the road and slowly made my way to the station. The lot was empty except for a single old sedan parked under one of the lights. The station itself was dimly lit, the neon sign above the door flickering intermittently. It looked like the kind of place you'd see in a horror movie, a place where everything went wrong, and the stranger always ends up dead. I should have turned around, but I was tired and the coffee seemed like a good idea. I stepped out of my car, the cold rain hitting my face as I hurried inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the inside of the station smelling like stale coffee and grease. The dim light inside did nothing to comfort me. It made the shadows feel deeper, more oppressive. Behind the counter stood a man, his back to me, staring at a computer screen. He was thin, his clothes a little too big, and his hair was greasy, hanging in strings. He didn't acknowledge me when I walked in, and I found myself standing there, unsure of what to do. I cleared my throat. Excuse me, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the empty station. Could I get a coffee? The man didn't move. His back remained to me, his eyes locked on the screen, as if he hadn't heard me at all. Hello, I said again, this time louder. Can I get a coffee? Finally, he turned, but it wasn't the movement I was expecting. It was slow, deliberate, as though he wasn't sure whether I was worth the trouble. When his eyes met mine, I immediately regretted speaking up. His eyes were hollow, like two black holes staring back at me. There was something in them, something cold. Coffee? His voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. Sure, but you sure you want it? His words lingered in the air like smoke, get it, and I could feel the unease creeping in. I forced myself to nod. Yeah, I'm just tired, I said, trying to mask the rising panic in my chest. He didn't say anything. He just walked over to the coffee machine, his footsteps slow and deliberate, like he was savoring every moment. As he prepared my cup, I tried to focus on the small details of the room, the faded advertisements on the walls, the cracked tile on the floor, the faint hum of a flickering light overhead. But the silence stretched on, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My eyes kept drifting back to the man behind the counter, whose back was now turned again as he continued to make the coffee. Suddenly I heard it, the faint sound of something scraping against the floor. It was barely audible over the storm outside, but it was there, just enough to make me stop and listen. The scraping grew louder, like something heavy dragging on the ground. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around, but the small convenience store was empty. There was no one else in sight. The sound continued, though, now more distinct, as if something or someone was moving toward me from the back of the store. "Do you have a bathroom?" I asked, my voice shaky. The man didn't answer at first. He didn't even look up from the counter. The scraping sound stopped, but I could still feel the tension hanging in the air. Finally, he nodded, his eyes never leaving the coffee machine. "Around back. You'll need the key." I quickly grabbed my coffee, muttering a quiet thanks, and turned toward the back of the station. The moment I stepped into the hallway, I felt it. An overwhelming, icy chill. The air smelled damp, like mildew and decay, and the narrow hallway stretched into darkness. I fumbled for the key the man had given me, but my fingers were trembling so badly I could hardly hold on to it. The sound of my own footsteps echoed in the empty space. Then the scraping noise returned, closer this time. It was like nails being dragged across the concrete, like someone was dragging something, or someone, along the floor. I couldn't bring myself to look back. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I approached the bathroom door. Just as I reached for the handle, I heard something else. A voice, faint but unmistakable. "Don't go in there." I froze. The voice wasn't the man's. It was a woman's, but it sounded distant, like it was coming from far away. I slowly turned around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. No sign of anyone else. Only the cold, empty hallway stretching out before me. I grabbed the bathroom door handle and yanked it open, stepping inside. The flickering light above the mirror cast long, distorted shadows across the tiny room. I didn't want to look into the mirror, but something in me couldn't resist. I did it anyway, and for a split second, I saw it. In the reflection, standing just behind me, was a figure. A woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and unblinking. She didn't move, but I felt her presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I screamed, but no sound came out. I spun around, but there was no one there. The bathroom was empty, the mirror reflecting only my own terrified face. My mind was racing, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I rushed out of the bathroom. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I made my way back down the hallway, but as I passed the counter, I noticed the man was gone. The door to the back room was slightly ajar, and I could hear the faint sound of whispering from inside. Without thinking, I bolted for the exit. I didn't look back. The rain still pounded against the windows as I ran to my car, hands slick with sweat as I fumbled to unlock the door. The moment I got inside, I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't even look to see if anyone was watching. I left that station behind me, but as I drove away, the rain started to let up. The roads were empty now, no other cars in sight, just the endless stretch of dark, wet asphalt. But the image of that woman, the feeling of her presence, stayed with me the whole way home, and I've never gone back to that gas station. Never. Because I know that whatever happened there, whatever I saw, wasn't a coincidence. Don't let these tales of terror end here. Subscribe for more and join our haunted family.
Next story.
I had always been the kind of person who enjoyed the solitude of driving at night. It was peaceful, almost meditative, as I cruised down long, empty stretches of road with only the hum of my car's engine for company. The night had a way of making everything seem distant, like the world beyond my headlights didn't exist. It was just me, the road, and the stars above. That night, however, things were different. I had just finished a business meeting in a small town about 2 hours from home. The drive back was supposed to be routine, just the usual stretch of highway, a few sleepy towns, and endless trees lining the road. The weather had been clear all day, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the wind picked up and the skies turned dark with clouds. A storm was coming, but I wasn't worried. I was used to these sorts of things. I wasn't even bothered when the first drops of rain began to fall, lightly at first, before becoming heavier. The road I was driving on was one I'd traveled many times. It ran through rural areas, with little to no streetlights to guide you. The only signs of civilization were the occasional farmhouse or gas station, miles apart from one another. The headlights of my car cut through the rain, the wipers frantically clearing the windshield as I kept my speed steady. It was around the time I passed a lone gas station that something strange happened. I saw a figure standing on the side of the road, up ahead. It was hard to make out at first, just a silhouette blurry against the heavy rain. I thought it might be a hitchhiker at first, but as I got closer, something about the figure didn't seem right. It was standing too still, almost unnaturally so. I slowed down, my instinct telling me to be cautious. As I drew nearer, I realized it was a woman. She was drenched, standing there in the downpour, wearing a pale blue dress that clung to her like a second skin. Her hair hung limp around her face, and her arms were raised at her sides as if she were waiting for something, or someone. Her eyes were fixed forward, unblinking, staring straight ahead into the darkness. I don't know why I slowed down. Maybe I felt sorry for her. Maybe I thought she needed help. Maybe it was the way she stood there, motionless. That unnerved me. There was something haunting about her presence. My car crept past her, and I glanced at her for a split second as I went by, but when I did, she turned her head toward me. I froze. Her eyes were wide, empty, like black voids. I could feel the chill of her gaze even through the rain and my fogged-up window. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know why, but I had to stop. Something inside me told me to turn around. I did. My car slid to a halt in the middle of the road, the engine stuttering as I turned it off. I pulled into a small turnout and threw the car in reverse, my heart hammering in my chest. I shouldn't have gone back. I knew that, but the unease gnawing at me pushed me forward. I rolled down my window, squinting through the rain, and there she was, the woman. But she wasn't standing there anymore. Instead, she was walking toward me, her feet making no sound against the wet pavement. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and as she got closer, I could see that her face was no longer just wet from the rain. Her expression was empty, hollow. Her lips were parted slightly as if she were about to speak, but no words came. I should have driven away, should have left right then and there. But I didn't. I was frozen, my eyes locked on hers, my body paralyzed by the sudden sense of dread that filled the air. I could feel her presence closing in on me, suffocating me, making the already oppressive rain feel heavier. And then she opened her mouth. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a word either. It was just a sound, a strange guttural noise, like someone trying to speak without a voice. It vibrated in my chest, deep and disturbing, and I had to fight to keep myself from vomiting. I snapped out of my trance and slammed the car into drive. My foot hit the accelerator, and I sped off down the road, not daring to look back. The woman's image was burned into my mind, but I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. The rain was still pouring down, the wipers struggling to clear the windshield, and I drove faster than I should have, my hands gripping the wheel too tightly. For the next few miles, I didn't see anything unusual, but the air was thick with tension. My heart was still pounding, and my palms were slick with sweat. I couldn't shake the image of her face, her hollow eyes, the strange noise that had come from her. I kept telling myself that it was just some trick of the mind, some strange thing I had imagined in the heat of the moment, but a part of me knew it wasn't. I had seen something that didn't belong on that road under that storm. Eventually, I passed through a small town and the tension in my chest began to ease. The lights, the noise of life returning to normal reassured me. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, my hands still trembling as I turned off the engine. I needed to stop, needed to get out of the car, just to breathe. The attendant was a young man, barely out of his teens, standing behind the counter. He glanced at me as I stepped out of the car, my soaked clothes sticking to my skin. I went inside, trying to act casual. "You okay, buddy?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I nodded, but my voice was shaky as I replied, "Yeah, just a weird thing on the road. I saw someone out there." The young man raised an eyebrow. "Saw someone out there? You mean like a person?" I nodded again, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "Yeah, a woman. She was just standing in the rain. Looked strange." The attendant's face went pale. He lowered his voice, leaning over the counter. "You're not the first one to say that. There's been talk for years about that stretch of road. People say there's a woman who shows up when it rains. She doesn't belong there. She doesn't look right. But if you stop for her, if you get close enough, she'll make you feel something. Something wrong." I couldn't breathe. The air in the gas station seemed to thicken, like it was pressing in on me. I felt dizzy, like the world was starting to spin. "She's been seen in that area for years," the attendant continued, his voice barely a whisper now, "but no one ever really talks about it. They just drive on by." I didn't say anything. I just stood there, feeling a cold sweat break out on my skin. I paid for the gas, got back in my car, and left, but I couldn't shake what he'd said. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know who she was or what she wanted. But I do know this. I'll never drive that road again. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to subscribe and be a part of our haunting journey.
Next story.
It was a dark and stormy night. I know. It sounds cliche, but that's exactly how it was. I had been driving for hours, well into the middle of nowhere, a part of the country where cell service is spotty at best and the roads stretch on forever. The rain had been coming down relentlessly since I left, and the wind had begun to howl through the trees as though it was warning me to turn back. But I couldn't. Not yet. I had to keep going. You see, I wasn't just driving anywhere. I was headed to my grandfather's cabin, deep in the woods where he had lived for as long as I could remember. He'd passed away a few weeks ago, and the family had decided to sell the place. As much as I hated the thought of it, I was tasked with going up there and clearing out the cabin. The road was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for my car to fit comfortably, with thick trees crowding in on both sides. The rain made the road slick, and I had to keep my wits about me as I navigated the turns. I had driven this road before many times, but tonight it felt different, darker, more foreboding. Then, as I rounded a bend, I saw it. A flash of light in the distance. It wasn't from a car, though. It wasn't even the typical glow of a streetlight. It was something strange, something that didn't quite fit with the environment. A soft, flickering light just ahead on the road. I slowed down, my curiosity getting the better of me. As I got closer, I saw it, a lantern hanging from a post by the side of the road. It was odd to see something like that in the middle of nowhere, with no houses for miles. The lantern's light danced in the wind, casting eerie shadows across the trees, and something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I pulled over, wondering if someone was in need of help. Maybe they had broken down, or worse, maybe there had been an accident. The rain had made visibility poor, so I thought it best to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the cold, wet night. The air was thick, humid with the storm, and I could barely hear anything other than the sound of the rain and the wind. But there was something else. A soft whisper, as if the trees themselves were speaking to me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. I walked toward the lantern, which now seemed to be glowing even brighter than before. But as I got closer, I realized something strange. It wasn't hanging from a post. It was floating in the air, just above the ground, gently swaying back and forth as though held by an invisible hand. I froze. My heart began to race, and every instinct in my body told me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't. Something compelled me to keep walking, to get closer to that light. That's when I saw it. Standing just beyond the lantern, in the thick shadows of the trees, was a figure. It was tall and thin, cloaked in dark rags, and its face was hidden under the hood of its cloak. Its body was impossibly still, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching me, waiting. I opened my mouth to call out, but the words caught in my throat. My breath quickened, and I stepped backward, ready to turn and run. But the figure moved before I could react. It stepped forward, its feet making no sound as they touched the wet earth. It was close now, so close that I could feel the cold radiating off of it. The air around it felt thick, suffocating, like I couldn't breathe. The figure raised its hand, long fingers curling in the direction of the lantern. The light flickered again, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist around us. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized something. There was no sound. Not a single sound. No rain, no wind, nothing. It was as if the world had stopped. Then, in a voice so quiet I could barely hear it over the pounding of my heart, it spoke. "Help me." The words sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't desperation. It was flat, emotionless, as though the figure had been waiting for me to hear those words for years. "Help me," it repeated. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the spot, my body frozen in terror. The figure's hand moved again, slowly, pointing to the woods behind it. The lantern swayed in the air, casting strange, twisting shadows across the trees. Without thinking, my legs started moving on their own, pulling me toward the figure. I didn't want to go, but my body betrayed me. I stumbled forward, unable to stop myself, until I was standing right in front of it. The figure's face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. The air around us grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply, and I could see my breath in the air. The ground beneath my feet became slick with frost, and the trees around us groaned in the wind. "Help me," it whispered again, this time with more urgency. The voice seemed to come from all around me, echoing in my mind, pressing on me from every direction. "Help you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Who are you?" There was no response. The figure stood motionless, its presence suffocating in the cold, damp air. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, couldn't break free from its grip. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, standing in front of me, and the next it was gone. The air lightened, the weight lifted, and the world around me seemed to snap back into focus. I stood there, panting, my body shaking with fear. The rain began to fall again, the sound of it hitting the trees and the ground filling the silence that had stretched on for far too long. I glanced around, but the figure was gone. There was no sign of it, no trace that it had ever been there. I didn't stay long enough to figure out what had just happened. I ran back to my car, my heart still racing, and slammed the door shut behind me. I didn't look back as I started the engine, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. I drove the rest of the way to the cabin in a daze, barely noticing the road or the rain. The lights of the cabin shone in the distance, a welcoming sight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, something I had seen but couldn't understand. It wasn't until I reached the cabin and stepped inside that I realized the full weight of what had happened. I glanced around the dusty, silent room, and that's when I saw it, the lantern. It was sitting on the table by the door, glowing softly, untouched by the rain. The same lantern, the same light. I never spoke of that night to anyone. I couldn't. The memory still haunts me, and I can't shake the voice that still whispers in my mind, "Help me." Feeling spooky? Keep the chills coming by subscribing to our channel for more ghostly stories.
Next story.
It was a Friday night, and I had just finished my shift at the diner. The rain had started up again, coming down in sheets, making the roads shimmer under the streetlights. I'd been planning to meet a couple of friends for a late-night hangout, but they had canceled at the last minute, so I found myself driving alone down the long, winding country road that led me home. At first, it wasn't so bad. The rain splattered against my windshield, and the wipers worked overtime to keep the view clear. I turned the radio up, trying to distract myself from the heaviness of the storm. But as I made my way past the last few houses, I noticed something odd. It wasn't a car. There was no one else on this road at this hour, but I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the distance by the side of the road. Just a silhouette, a dark shape barely visible against the backdrop of trees. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, unsure of whether my mind was playing tricks on me or if there was really someone out there. I had the thought to pull over, ask if they needed help, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, staring at the road. Something about it made my skin crawl, but I dismissed the feeling, telling myself it was just the storm and my tired mind making me paranoid. The figure was still there as I drove past, but I couldn't shake the image of it out of my head. I told myself that I'd been too quick to judge, maybe just imagining things. It was nothing, just the rain and the wind messing with my senses. But then, a few miles down the road, something strange happened. My car stalled. The engine cut out completely, and I coasted to a stop on the side of the road. My heart raced as I tried to start the car again, but the engine sputtered, then fell silent. I turned the key a few more times, but it didn't budge. Great, just great. I pulled out my phone to call a tow truck, but I had no service. The rain was coming down harder now, the sound of it pounding on the roof of my car like 1,000 tiny fists. The only light came from the dim glow of the dashboard. I checked my watch, 1:30 a.m. No one would be driving through here at this hour. I was alone. After a few minutes of trying in vain to restart the car, I opened the door and stepped out. The cold air hit me like a punch, the rain drenching me almost immediately. The road was desolate, and the trees loomed ominously in the distance, their branches swaying with the wind. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and started walking, hoping I'd be able to find a house or some sort of shelter. But then I saw it again. That same figure. It was standing in the same spot as before, just a silhouette in the distance. This time, though, it was closer, much closer. I froze. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just a person. I could see that now. There was something wrong with the way it stood, unnaturally still, unnervingly silent. The figure slowly started walking toward me. My first instinct was to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. I couldn't move. I could hear the sound of the rain, the splattering of droplets hitting the ground, but there was nothing else, no footsteps, no sound of movement, just an eerie silence. The figure kept walking toward me, its outline growing clearer with each step. It was tall, almost unnaturally tall, and the closer it got, the more I felt like I was staring into something wrong. Its face was obscured by the hood of a dark coat, but I could see its hands, long, unnaturally thin, and pale. The fingers seemed to stretch unnervingly as it reached out. I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words caught in my throat. The figure took another step forward, and the rain seemed to stop for just a moment, as if the world itself held its breath. And then, in the brief silence, I heard it. A whisper, low and almost inaudible, coming from the figure's direction. "Help me." I felt a chill run through me, colder than the rain, colder than the night itself. My stomach dropped. The voice, it sounded like a woman, but there was something wrong with it. It was hollow, empty. The words echoed in my head, repeating over and over. "Help me. Help me. I had to get away. I had to move." I finally managed to tear my feet from the ground, stumbling backward, my heart pounding in my chest as I turned and sprinted toward my car. The figure didn't follow, but I could feel its presence behind me, the air growing colder the further I ran. I reached my car in a panic, and somehow, through sheer will, I managed to turn the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. I didn't look back as I slammed the gear shift into drive and sped off down the road. I drove without stopping for miles, barely noticing the road, the rain, or the time passing. The only thing on my mind was getting as far away from that place as possible. I didn't know what I had seen, what had been following me, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back there. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town an hour later that I felt safe enough to stop. I pulled into the first gas station I found, my hands still trembling. The place was quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights. The attendant gave me a strange look when I walked in, soaking wet, my eyes wide with panic. "You all right, miss?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I didn't know what to say. I shook my head and muttered something about my car breaking down. He seemed to buy it, nodding in sympathy, but I could see the look in his eyes. The look that told me he'd heard this kind of story before. "You're not the first to see her," he said, voice low, almost like a whisper. "That road, it's got a history. People say there's a woman out there, died years ago, never made it home." I froze, the blood draining from my face. The figure, the voice, the coldness that had seeped into my bones. "She never left," the attendant continued. "They say she still walks that road looking for help, but it's never real. She won't let you leave once she's found you." I couldn't speak. I paid for the gas and left as quickly as I could, but the image of the figure in the rain stayed with me. Even now, as I'm telling you this, I can still hear that whisper in my ears. Help me. I'll never forget that road. Want more spine-chilling stories? Hit the subscribe button now.
Next story.
I had always been a skeptic when it came to ghost stories. As a child, I'd listened to my grandmother's tales about the haunted woods near our house, the ones where children had disappeared or where people swore they'd seen figures lurking in the trees. But I never believed any of it. Not until that night. It started as a normal evening, at least at first. I was in my early 20s, just starting out in life, and I'd gotten a new job that required me to drive through the country to visit clients. It wasn't the most exciting gig, but it paid the bills. Most of the time, the roads were empty, the views were peaceful, and I didn't mind the isolation. But there was one road I was always hesitant to drive, the old highway that cut through the forest. It was narrow, twisted, and didn't have much traffic, which made me uncomfortable, especially when the sun set. That night, I had to take that highway. I'd stayed too long at the office, and there wasn't any other way to get home without taking a long detour. The rain had started coming down in sheets, and the mist was so thick that I could barely see beyond the car's headlights. The radio was silent except for static, and the wipers struggled against the downpour. I tried to focus on the road, but it felt like the darkness around me was pressing in from all sides. I turned onto the highway, the familiar stretch of road now feeling eerie and foreign in the storm. My headlights barely penetrated the mist, and the tall trees that lined the road looked like dark silhouettes looming over me. The air felt heavier than usual, the kind of damp chill that sinks into your bones. But I pushed on, trying to shake the creeping feeling that had started to gnaw at me. About halfway down the road, I saw something in the distance. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from a puddle or a glint of something in the trees. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a woman, standing by the side of the road. I almost didn't stop. Something in my gut told me to drive on, to ignore her. But I couldn't. I had always been taught to help people in need, and she looked like she was stranded. I slowed down, the car's tires skimming through the wet asphalt. The woman didn't move, didn't even acknowledge that I was getting closer. She was standing perfectly still, her back to the road. I pulled up beside her, rolling down the window just a crack. The rain was pounding so hard now that I could barely hear anything. But when I called out to her, asking if she needed help, she didn't respond. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked again, my voice louder this time. But still, no answer. I glanced at her more closely. Her clothes were soaked through, and her hair hung limply around her face. She was wearing a pale dress, one that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, though it looked old, as if it had seen better days. My eyes flickered back to her face, and that's when I saw it. Her eyes weren't right. They were wide, too wide, as if they had been stretched, and they glowed faintly, like pale moonlight reflecting off water. I felt a cold wave wash over me, and every instinct in my body screamed to drive away, but I couldn't move. I was frozen. "Can you hear me?" I called again, but this time my voice faltered. There was something about her, something in the way she stood, unnaturally still, eerily silent, that made my heart race in my chest. Suddenly, without warning, she turned toward me. Her head whipped around so fast, so unnaturally quick, that I heard a faint crack, like the snap of dry twigs. I gasped, my body jerking back, my foot pressing down on the brake. She wasn't smiling. There was no expression on her face at all. Her lips were slightly parted, but no sound came from her mouth. She was staring at me, her eyes wide and unblinking, her pupils completely black, swallowed by the darkness in her gaze. "Do you need help?" I whispered, more to myself than to her, my voice shaking. The air around her seemed to grow colder, and the mist thickened. For a moment, I thought I saw her figure flicker, like a broken image on a TV screen. She took a step closer, her bare feet barely touching the ground, the movement so fluid it almost seemed like she was gliding. I slammed the car into gear, my foot on the gas, and I sped away without a second thought, the tires screeching as I tore down the road. But I didn't dare to look back. I couldn't. Something inside of me told me that if I looked back, I would see something far worse than just a woman by the road. I drove for miles, the rain pounding harder, the fog thick and suffocating. Every turn, every twist of the road felt like it was leading me deeper into the unknown, like I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, and my eyes darted nervously to the rearview mirror, though I was afraid of what I might see. Nothing. There was no sign of her. No shadow. No figure standing in the middle of the road. I almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just a trick of the storm, the rain, the late hour. But then, as I turned a sharp corner, I saw something in the distance. It was the same woman, standing in the middle of the road, in the same pale dress, her head tilted back, her face turned to the sky as if she was waiting for something. I slammed the brakes, the car jerking to a stop just feet from her. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with terror, watching as she slowly turned her head toward me, her expression still blank, her black eyes glowing in the dim light. Then, before I could even blink, she was gone, vanished into the mist, as though she had never been there at all. I didn't stick around to figure out what had just happened. I floored the gas pedal and never looked back. I didn't care if I had to drive through the night. Nothing was going to make me stop again. The rest of the drive was a blur, and when I finally reached home, I locked every door and pulled every curtain. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that the storm and the darkness had gotten to me. But I knew what I saw. I didn't speak about it to anyone. But from that night on, I took the long way home, avoiding that highway and the woman in the mist. I never saw her again, but I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, waiting for someone else to stop. Scared yet? Subscribe for more tales from the dark side that'll send shivers down your spine.
Next story.
I wasn't planning on taking that route, not at night, and especially not with the storm rolling in. But my GPS had taken me down a road I hadn't recognized, and it was too late to turn back. I had already been driving for over 4 hours, and my mind was starting to slip. The fatigue was setting in, and I just wanted to get home. The rain had been steady for a while now, and the wind had picked up. The trees along the sides of the road swayed and creaked, casting long, twisted shadows in the beam of my headlights. The temperature had dropped too, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. My windshield wipers couldn't seem to keep up with the downpour, and it was getting harder to see. My eyes kept darting between the road and the GPS, but the device was glitching, its screen flickering in and out of focus. I couldn't see much of anything ahead of me except the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the road for a split second. I kept my foot on the gas, trying to push through, telling myself I was almost there. The world outside felt strange, quiet, almost oppressive. It was like the storm had swallowed up every sound, and the road had become a tunnel, isolating me from everything else. The trees that lined the road were thick, dark masses, blocking out any glimpse of light from the sky. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by a tree or a rock. But as I got closer, I realized it was something standing in the middle of the road. A person, I thought. But no, this wasn't a person. It was too still, too unnatural. It was standing there, completely motionless, as if waiting for something. My heart began to race as I hit the brakes. The rain was making it hard to stop quickly, and the tires squealed on the slick asphalt. I managed to bring the car to a halt a few feet away from it. The figure didn't move. My headlights illuminated it, and that's when I saw it clearly. It wasn't a person at all. The shape was tall, unnaturally tall, like a shadow stretched out far too long. It was dressed in a long, dark cloak, but the material didn't shimmer or reflect the light. It absorbed it. The cloak seemed to blend with the darkness around it. The figure's head was tilted slightly, and I couldn't make out any features, just a hollow, black space where a face should have been. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, my hands gripping the steering wheel as if they were the only thing keeping me from bolting out of the car. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. There was something about the figure that made my skin crawl, something that seemed wrong, inhuman. I backed up a little, my hands shaking, but as soon as I did, the figure moved. It didn't step forward, it didn't walk, it simply shifted, sliding toward the car with an unnatural gliding motion. The air around it seemed to ripple, and I could feel a strange coldness seep into the car, as if the warmth of the storm had been sucked away. I slammed the car into reverse, heart pounding in my chest. my foot pressing down on the gas. The wheels spun for a moment, then caught, sending the car skidding back. But just as I was about to speed away, the figure was in front of me again. It was standing in the middle of the road, blocking my path. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. My eyes locked onto it, unable to look away. It didn't speak. It didn't make a sound. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The world felt heavier, like the air itself had thickened, and I couldn't breathe properly. I wasn't sure what had just happened. Had I seen it at all? Or was it just a hallucination brought on by fatigue? But no, the feeling was too real. I knew what I had seen. I didn't waste any more time. I slammed the car into drive and floored the gas pedal, pushing the car as fast as it would go. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The rain pounded against the windshield harder than ever, the wipers struggling to keep up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something just beyond my peripheral vision, lurking in the dark. I glanced at the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I saw something there, moving, but when I looked again, it was gone. I kept driving, pushing through the storm, my hands slick with sweat on the wheel. It felt like the night had become endless. The road stretching out in front of me, no sign of a turn or a stop. But eventually, the storm began to lessen, and the rain started to taper off. The trees thinned out, and I saw streetlights in the distance. I was almost home. Almost free. But when I reached the next intersection, I was forced to stop at a red light. The street was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My eyes darted around nervously, and then I saw it again. The figure. It was standing across the street on the opposite side of the intersection, barely visible in the dim glow of the street lamp. It was watching me. My breath caught in my throat. My hands gripped the steering wheel harder, my knuckles turning white. The light turned green, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. I had no choice. I had to leave. I slammed the car into gear and sped through the intersection without looking back. I didn't stop again, didn't dare to slow down. I could feel the figure's eyes on me, following me even as I drove away. I finally made it home, my hands shaking, my heart still pounding. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen. It seemed too insane, too impossible. But every time I drive down that road, every time I pass that intersection, I wonder if the figure is still there, waiting. I wonder if it will follow me again, if it will ever leave me alone. It's been months since that night, but the memories haven't faded. The figure is still there, in the back of my mind, lurking in the shadows, and I know no matter how far I go, no matter how fast I drive, it will always find me. Get ready for more spooky stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
Next story.
It was a calm evening when I started my drive. Nothing out of the ordinary. The rain had just begun to fall lightly, tapping against my windshield in a rhythmic pattern, soothing almost. I was returning home from a friend's place, a trip I'd made countless times before, and it was late, around 1:30 a.m. The roads were mostly deserted, and my car hummed steadily as I cruised along the wet highway. The headlights cut through the night, illuminating just enough of the path ahead. As I drove, the rain began to pick up, and soon I was surrounded by sheets of water. The wind howled, rattling the trees along the roadside, and it felt like the world was closing in on me, the storm growing stronger with each passing mile. The road I was on was narrow and winding, a two-lane highway that cut through dense forest. It was notorious for being deserted at night, a place I usually avoided, but there were no other options. I needed to get home. I couldn't see much through the windshield except for the occasional flash of my wipers. The storm made it hard to focus on anything, but I kept driving. That's when I saw it. In the distance, at the edge of my headlights, there was a figure standing by the side of the road. I almost missed it at first because it was so dark, but then it moved. It wasn't a person walking. No, it was something much stranger. It stood unnaturally still, its head slightly tilted to one side. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But as I got closer, the figure remained. It was standing on the shoulder of the road, drenched in rain. At that moment, I felt a jolt of discomfort settle in my chest. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. Something about the way it stood was too wrong. My foot instinctively pressed harder on the brake, slowing the car down. I had to know what it was. Was it a person in distress? A stranded driver? I wasn't sure, but I wasn't about to ignore it. As I neared the figure, it didn't move. The closer I got, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary person. The figure was tall, much taller than a regular person should be. It seemed to be completely covered in a long black cloak, the fabric whipping wildly in the wind. But there was no movement, no indication that it was breathing or even alive. It simply stood there, staring ahead as though it had been waiting for me. I couldn't stop myself from pulling over. I knew I should keep driving, but something inside me told me to stop. Maybe it was the same reason people slow down to look at accidents on the highway, compelled by curiosity or something darker. I parked the car and rolled down the window a few inches, my heart racing in my chest. "Hey," I called out, my voice wavering slightly in the storm. "Are you all right?" There was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. I called out again, louder this time. Nothing. Just the wind and the relentless rain. Suddenly I felt it. The cold. A bone-deep chill that swept over me, as if the air itself had turned frigid. My hands froze on the steering wheel, and a voice inside my head screamed at me to leave. The rain seemed to intensify, and with it the silence grew heavier. I glanced into the rearview mirror, trying to make sense of the unease creeping up my spine. But when I looked back ahead, the figure had moved. It was standing right in front of the car now, much closer than it had been just seconds ago. I couldn't see its face, but the cloak billowed around it, as if it were being blown in all directions by the wind. Its presence was overwhelming, like something ancient, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. A loud, high-pitched sound suddenly broke through the storm. A shrill, inhuman noise, like a screeching wind through a cracked window, filled the air. My eyes widened in terror, and before I could even process it, the figure moved, quickly, impossibly fast. One moment it was in front of me, and the next it was gone. Vanished into the dark woods on the side of the road, leaving only the rain and the sound of my rapid breathing. I didn't wait another second. I slammed the car into gear and sped away, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't care about the rain, the slick roads, or anything else. I just needed to get away from whatever that thing was. I didn't look back, didn't dare to check the rearview mirror. As I drove, my mind raced. Was it a person playing a twisted prank? No, this wasn't a prank. I knew that, deep down, there was something wrong with what I had seen, something beyond the realms of logic and reason. A deep, primal fear settled in my gut. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I never wanted to see it again. I made it home in one piece, but the strange events of that night haunted me for weeks. I couldn't shake the image of the figure, its silhouette against the storm, the unnatural stillness of its posture. I told myself it was just a figment of my imagination, tiredness, the storm, my mind playing tricks on me. But part of me knew it wasn't. Then, months later, I heard the stories. The whispers from the locals who had driven that same stretch of road late at night. People talked about seeing strange things, figures in the rain, tall shadows standing by the road. Some even claimed they saw the figure move, just like I had. It wasn't just one person either. There were multiple accounts, all eerily similar. The story they all told was the same. A tall, cloaked figure standing by the side of the road, waiting for someone. Some said it would vanish when you drove by, others said it would follow your car for miles, but no one knew for sure what it wanted or why it was there. I never drove that road again, and every time it rained, I couldn't help but feel the weight of that night pressing down on me, as though the figure was still waiting, still watching, somewhere out there in the storm.